Let's go over three major argument models that we'll be talking about in this class. We'll talk about the classical model, which you're familiar with, Toulmin, and Rogerian. First of all, let's look at a few of the key terms that you might see when we're discussing arguments. Deductive reasoning is, in traditional Aristotelian logic, it's the process of reasoning in which a conclusion follows necessarily from the stated premises. Basically, you're inferencing from the general to the specific. So these general ideas, you're deducing down to a specific kind of conclusion. Inductive is the opposite. That's where you go from a specific kind of evidence all the way to a general conclusion. So those are two phrases you might see when we're talking about argument. Also the syllogism. This is a three-part deductive argument in which a conclusion follows from two premises. Here's a really straightforward example. Here's your major premise, all people have hearts, and a minor premise, John is a person, and your conclusion is therefore John has a heart. John has a heart. So this is just review. You guys know this. Syllogism is that really straightforward kind of logic that you see in a lot of these classic arguments. If this is true and this is true, then this is true. Classical arguments began in ancient Greece approximately in the 5th century BC. These were communicated orally and designed to be easily understood by listeners. They're based on formal logic, including the syllogism. Okay, this is just your classic argument. So there are 6 elements: an introduction where you capture the attention of your audience and urge the audience to consider your case. Then you have a statement of background where you narrate the key facts and or events leading up to your case. Proposition states the position you are taking based on the information you've already presented and sets up the structure for the rest of your argument. That's basically what you believe and claim. Proof, where you discuss your reasons for your position and provide evidence to support each reason. So those are sources, quotes, statistics, examples, things like that. Refutation. This is where you anticipate the opposing viewpoints and then you demonstrate why your approach is the only acceptable one. So you should choose, even though I understand the opposing argument, you should still believe in what I'm saying because of X, Y, and Z. So refutation is kind of like bringing the ethos that shows that you've done your research in your argument and that you do understand what the opposing view might think. And then your conclusion is where you summarize your most important points and can include appeals to feeling or values. So ending on that pathos appeal. Here's an example of a classical argument. Dog is said to be man's best friend, but is their function in our human society even more integral than this quote portrays? Then you give some background. Dogs are loyal, loving, perpetually optimistic, athletic, and obedient. And here's your thesis or your claim. Dogs have been essential to human society since the dawn of our civilization, evolving from hunting companions and personal protection to the modern utility of seeing eye dogs and police canine units. Dogs are essential to our society because they aid humans physically, emotionally, and socially. And then your proof, where you give something to back up what you're saying. Physically, dogs are integral helpers and motivators, from sheep herders to taking your dog on walks. Emotionally, dogs are loyal and loving, always there to greet you at the door. Their love unconditional, even when undeserved. Socially, dogs not only invite interactions with other humans, but can also aid people who have socially debilitating handicaps. Refutation. This is where you will talk about an opposing viewpoint to show that you acknowledge that it's there. But then in the end, you're basically still going to say, even though we know this about the opposite side, you should still believe in my premise. The cat people would say that cats too can be loving and loyal, but no cat would drag a grown man from a burning building to save his life. The cat people would say that no human beings die from cat attacks, while dog attacks create injuries or even take lives every year. While this is a factual statement, it oversimplifies the issue. Dogs do not attack humans unprovoked. A dog who attacks has been abused, mistreated, or is responding to a threat, or assumes they are protecting their loved ones. Do cats only attack when provoked? Absolutely not. And in conclusion, dogs are not only man's best friend, but also an essential and valuable cog in the machinery of human society. They help us to better function, help us to better feed not only our stomachs, but also our hearts and souls. There's obviously an appeal to pathos here, and the structure of these sentences and the word choice, like valuable cog in the machinery of human society. There's obviously a switch in language here to end that classical argument. Next, we'll discuss the Toulmin Model. This is a model that was developed by British philosopher Stephen Toulmin in the 1950s. And it emphasizes that logic is often based on probability rather than certainty, and it focuses on claims. So let's get into his model. These are the three main components of the Toulmin model. The claim, which is the main point or your position. This is your thesis. This is the thing that you believe or you are arguing. Data is the evidence supporting the claim or the reasons. So I believe this because this. So that's claim and data. Warrant is an underlying assumption or basic principle that connects data and claim, often implied rather than explicit. Okay, you need to understand that the warrant is almost always implied. It's never usually said out loud. The warrant is that thing, that line of reasoning in the middle of the claim and the data that connects the two together. So here's an example. Claim, my parents should allow me to drive their car to my friend's house. That's what I believe, right? The data that you're giving your parents. The parents of nearly all the juniors at school have given their children permission to drive their car to friends' houses. So the underlying assumption between the claim that you're saying and the data that you're saying is this idea, this warrant. My parents should act in accordance with the other parents of juniors at the school. Now, if you're giving this argument to your parents, you would never actually say that warrant out loud. It's implied when you said, the parents of all the other juniors let their kids do it. So here's the snag. What if your parents don't buy your warrant? What if they don't think that they should necessarily do what other parents are doing? This is where the argument's going to break down, okay? How can you still get permission to drive the car to a friend's house, or at least have a better chance of giving permission? You need to try new data, which would imply that you are getting a new warrant. So a more convincing data, which is the second thing here, instead of saying the parents of nearly all the juniors at school have given their children permission, you could say something like, my parents should allow me to drive their car to my friend's house because I'm responsible and I will be home at my curfew. And your warrant would be that implicit thing that you're trying to argue is, my parents should trust me because I'm responsible. My parents should trust me with this because I can be home by my curfew or whatever. So that's like a really simple example of how you can think about other people's arguments. If you can get to the warrant and understand what that implicit thing is, you can either break down an argument or help as you are arguing your point. You can start thinking of like the underlying argument a little bit differently in order to get your point across. And I hope your parents aren't mad at me for giving you this idea to change the warrant when you're trying to ask them for something. So here, I'm just going to show you this, and we're not going to get into the types of warrants, but here they are here that we're going to talk about in class. The acronym for this is GASCAP. So generalization, analogy, sign, causality, authority, and principle. These are types of warrants. These are types of underlying arguments that are connecting your claim to your data. Here's a little picture of the Toulmin argument. So again, you have your claim over here, the thing that you believe. The data, which is because. So my parents should let me drive the car because I will get the car back by curfew and be safe. And that warrant under here is that implicit thing like parents should trust their kids who say they will, be safe and get back on time. Qualifier is the conditions or the limits to the claim. So that's when you say you have to put a limit or a claim on it, or say in these conditions only does this claim make sense. Then down here you have a rebuttal. Similar to the classical model, the rebuttal is kind of like that refutation where you come in and you address the opposing viewpoint and say that you understand what that is, but you still say your claim. Okay, so using the rebuttal in a way to back up what your claim is. And backing is like all the logic and reasoning and evidence to support the warrant. Backing doesn't have to do with data. Backing has to do with backing up the line of argument, which is that implicit warrant. Lastly, let's talk about the Rogerian model. This was developed by a psychologist named Carl Rogers, also in the 1950s, and it emphasizes problem solving or coming to a consensus. So this is a little bit different than the classical model that relied on strict logic, where if your logic made sense, you could just destroy your opponent, okay? Carl Rogers thought maybe we're ignoring the opposing viewpoint and it's not helping us in our arguments. Maybe we need to think about and address and try to understand the opposition's argument in order to come to a consensus. So this allows the author to appear open-minded or even objective, and it's appropriate in contexts where you need to convince a resistant opponent to at least respect your views. So here's the structure of a Rogerian argument. You have your introduction, statement of a problem to be solved or question to be answered, summary of opposing views. So you're starting with acknowledging what the opposite side would say. Described using a seemingly objective persona. So you aren't using inflammatory language when talking about opposing views. You are saying, this is what you might think over here. This is what I believe you are saying. Statement of understanding. Concedes circumstances under which opposing views might be valid. So this is where you have some sort of concession where you say, I understand what the opposing view says, but I also understand that the circumstances around that might make you think that that's correct. And then you come in and you state your position and your context. So you describe context in which your position applies and works well. That's where you say, even though you believe that in that circumstance it works, my position is over here, and this is how it's going to work in this context. And then you give statement of benefits, appeals to self-interest of readers who may not agree with you, and demonstrates how your position benefits them. It's a completely different structure. So here's an example. Should students wear uniforms? Okay, that's the issue that we need to talk about. Then you start with the opposing views. Some argue yes, as uniforms create a sense of equality and highlight the person, not the materials they wear. Others say no because uniforms limit self-expression and individuality. And the statement of understanding. I understand the point of view that uniforms, in making students look the same, may also make them feel that they are all the same, unable to express their personal style and individuality. So we're looking at like the different points of view of this. And then you come in here with your statement of your position. However, I think the above belief is mistaken because in reality it should not be the materials we wear that define who we are, but rather our actions, our words, our talents. With this in mind, I believe uniforms are a quality addition to any school policy. Here's your statement of context. If your shoes are Nike brand, that does not tell me that you are a talented athlete, merely that you or your parents have the money to purchase brand names. If you wear purple, that does not tell me you are a talented artist, merely that you have a preference for purple. And the statement of benefits. Meanwhile, in a uniform, brand names do not exist, and economic status is no longer a barrier. In a uniform, rather than your clothes speaking for you, you speak for yourself. In a uniform, you must prove to the world and yourself that you are a talented athlete or artist or mathematician. Ironically, by making everyone look the same, uniforms allow us to truly become unique. So that part is where you're kind of like fleshing out how your position is good and giving backing to what you said. So the Rogerian model is very different, and you wouldn't use this in all contexts. This is appropriate for contexts where some reluctant opposition are against what you're saying. Okay, and that is the really quick overview of the three methods of argument.